Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. I hope you had a great Labor Day weekend, and it is now Tuesday, so we are already starting the week already. However, setting one of those days aside, and yesterday I want to thank those that were involved in playing a repeat program for their work, and we're going to spend some time today looking at a number of different topics. This first hour, we're going to talk about policing, and if we have certainly tried to address this issue ever since the death of George Floyd, I think sometimes naively thought that the issue was all about trying to improve the police. Actually, in some respects, we could see how some wanted to use this to advance all sorts of other agenda. But my booklet that I produced a while back on a biblical view on criminal justice is a way to begin to think about some of the issues we've discussed here before. That is better training, questions about everything from no-knock raids to police unions and a variety of others. The answer is not defund the police, and so you will find that one of the articles we have posted here actually addresses that issue. Don't defund the police, improve policing. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that. And then the commentary today that I have is on the NBA boycott. A little bit later I'm going to play, or at least discuss some of the material that came out by Larry Elder having to do with the NBA athletes and a variety of other topics. So these will all kind of come together here in this first hour. Next hour, George Barna will be with us. We're going to look at various policies. His argument is that on the ballot is really a set of worldview questions. And just as we've said that we think judges are on the ballot and pro-life issues are on the ballot, worldviews are on the ballot. So we'll be talking about that with him. And in the last hour, if you can join us certainly online, Robin Steele with us. That will be for our national hour, but you may be listening on a radio station that doesn't carry the third hour. How to be made whole. So we have a lot to cover over the next couple of hours. I think you will really appreciate the conversation. And first of all, let me get to Randy Peterson. He is a senior researcher at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, author of this particular article that we've posted on our website, Don't Defund the Police, Improve Policing. He not only is a researcher there at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, but spent 21 years in law enforcement in Bloomingdale, Illinois. He, before that, also had done some other activity, but then, of course, moved to the state of Texas, where he is located now, and first was the director of the Tarrant County College District Criminal Justice Training Center. So not only has he worked in law enforcement, he has been involved in training, has both his bachelor's degree in legal studies and his master's degree in justice administration and crime management from Bellevue University up there in Nebraska. And Randy, I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. Thank you for having me.
Talk about the genesis of this article. I would imagine as somebody who is in law enforcement and then also training those people in law enforcement, when you started seeing these signs that said defund the police, you were thinking, nope, that's going the wrong way. We need better training. We need more money. We don't need less money. We need more people out on the streets making a difference. And so in some respects, I gather that's why you wrote this article in the first place.
Exactly, you're exactly right. When those first few weeks of defunding started to take hold or started to be mentioned, no one was really seriously considering that. I mean, that even the left and the right probably could agree that the police are necessary. And then all of a sudden, it really picked up speed before anyone got their feet on the ground to say, wait a minute, this is a bad idea. Are we seriously discussing this?
And one of the things I appreciate about that is you kind of take us to some of the biblical material. First of all, you said conservatives are not new to the idea of police reform. If nothing else, we recognize the police have the most intrusive authorities in all of government. And so first off, we recognize that we should be concerned about that because we do put in the hands of law enforcement officers, and you know that both as a person who is out on the street and also training those who are going to go out on the street. And so in some respects, because of that, conservatives are not opposed to the idea of police reform. If anything, they, in many cases, have been talking about it for some time, haven't they?
Yes, exactly. The conservatives are generally supportive of law enforcement because they respect the legitimacy of the institution, and there's biblical foundations for that as well. But they also recognize, as our founders did, that there needs to be a healthy skepticism of government. And obviously with the police being the most intrusive powers, the use of force congregated within their authority, they're subject to skepticism and constant reevaluation, reform, improvement. I like the term improvement better. Reform makes it sound like they're doing everything wrong and they need to be completely changed, which is not the case. But the conservatives are right to look at police improvements and throughout the whole criminal justice system. It's not just in policing.
You also said something in passing that you have as your third paragraph, the fact that we also recognize the legitimate role of government, and you quote from Romans chapter 13, for again, government, and that is the minister that is indeed given that responsibility, bearing the sword, is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, or sword for nothing. And so we recognize that there is a very legitimate role for law enforcement. There's a very legitimate role for government. And so anybody that says, well, you conservatives just anti-government. No, we recognize the legitimate role. But at the same time, when some people step outside of that role, when they, if they're maybe in the legislature or they're a governor or a president or whatever, call for us to do things that are outside of their legitimate role, then we raise questions. Or if an individual who is given the authority of physical force, given the authority of the sword, does something that is wrong, then we would certainly challenge that. But we also recognize how legitimate law enforcement is and will always be in any kind of civilized society.
Right, and it'd be difficult to say it any better than you just did there. And I think the biblical foundation for government having a role in our lives establishes the legitimacy for us, particularly for conservatives. But that line in particular also establishes the legitimacy of the use of force. And I think what we're seeing now is that when the left has very strongly attempted to delegitimize the police, right, to have everyone see them as not legitimate. And once that happens, then no use of force is justified, right? If you don't think the police are a legitimate institution anymore, then any force that they use is unjustified, no matter how it played out. And we're seeing them make those attacks, right? Because they're not just protesting and rioting when questionable uses of force happen, right? Questionable police actions. They're rioting almost immediately now, even when we have instances where the suspect pointed a gun at the police and was killed. So their efforts have redoubled in trying to delegitimize the police.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about a couple of issues in your article. By the way, I would encourage those of you that would like to know more. We have posted that on the website. It originally appeared in the Austin American-Statesman, and of course it also is available through the Texas Public Policy Foundation, but wanted to talk about a couple of issues. Number one, the use of force, which we're just talking about, and another issue we've mentioned here occasionally, the issue of the over-criminalization of the criminal justice system. We'll talk about both of those right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Should professional basketball players be allowed to boycott their games? Well, of course. Current NBA players, along with players in the past, have used the forum to address social issues. Technically, the decision last month was probably best described as a strike rather than a boycott, and it led to many other professional teams canceling their games as well. In a well-written and thoughtful piece, Andrew McCarthy argues that the action may be somewhat illogical, but certainly allowable. He says for a work stoppage to be successful, it has to withhold something the potential consumer wants. As he puts it, the sand is running out of the hourglass. Now, most spectators turn to sports to get away from politics and politicized issues, at least for a few hours. And it has been, in the past, an oasis from the turmoil, but that oasis is beginning to disappear. Much of it surfaced over the Star-Spangled Banner, which wasn't even the national anthem until 1931, and it wasn't even routinely played before sporting events until World War II. He says he wishes that patriotic displays were not controversial, but fine. If playing the anthem sullies the experience for a sizable number of fans, let's not do it. But the biggest issue is whether we should allow protest at the game. The owners and the NBA have decided to indulge the behavior for now. The players are free to kneel before the game or even boycott the game. But you know what? The spectators are also free to boycott the league and tune them out. Freedom works both ways. McCarthy says he loves sports, but sporting events are just one of many things he enjoys. During this playoff run, the NBA players are in a bubble because of the pandemic. That means they play to lots of empty seats. But if they keep up this behavior, they will be playing to lots of empty seats next year. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we have Randy Peterson with us for a few more minutes. Again, I would really commend to you this article that originally was published in the Austin American-Statesman, but it's also available through our friends at Texas Public Policy Foundation. We have a link to them. And, of course, we have the link to this. And it's a very short article. It only takes 2 pages to print out. I think you would really benefit from it. And, Randy, let's talk about this idea of the use of force. What I think, first of all, I want our listeners to recognize is that when you see a short video clip, you think you know it all, and then we find out more. We've seen what preceded, of course, the death of George Floyd. We see what preceded the shooting of the individual in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I watched one the other day where they had just a very short clip of something that happened, I think it was in Aurora, Illinois. Then they showed the entire body cam footage, and you're thinking, all they showed was when he finally had to pull her out of the car, and not the 20 different times he asked her to get out nicely or to give him her license or anything. And so when you look at it in its context, oftentimes you can understand that those of you in law enforcement sometimes are overly patient, maybe more patient than some of us even in listening to this would be. But when you do use force, as you say, sometimes it looks ugly, but it may be necessary. Help us out with that.
Yes, the use of force by anyone is almost always ugly, even when it's completely justified. And even conservatives kind of recoil at the images of a police officer using force, because that is the ultimate intrusion by the government, right? A government official using force against the citizen. So there's a visceral reaction to that. However, it is absolutely necessary in some circumstances, but absolutely necessary is not the standard that police officers are held to. Graham versus Connor, the case in the late 80s that has kind of painted the use of force landscape from a judicial standpoint when the Supreme Court decided it, said that the force must be objectively reasonable, meaning that the force that the officer uses has to be reasonable objectively, so that it's not subjectively, right? It's not anybody who looks at it says, "Oh, that's terrible," and it's unjustified. It's through the eyes of a similarly trained police officer in similar circumstances. Would it be reasonable to that officer? So the force levels actually change based on a lot of variables, and you named one of them, right? The context, what's happening at the scene. Who is the person being encountered? Is it a 90-pound female that's 80 years old, or is it a 20-year-old former, linebacker in high school, from high school? And that changes the force spectrum that the officer might be employing, and then the officer themselves is the ultimate variable. How are they trained? How are they skilled? What's their physical makeup? What's their psychological situation? How legitimately afraid are they during the encounter that they need to use force? So that the standard is not necessary force, it's reasonable force. And that's important for a couple of reasons. The courts do not require officers to use the least intrusive method, right? If an officer shoots somebody, they look at it and say, was the shooting justified? Was deadly force justified in this situation? Not what else could they have done. That's not to be considered under the Graham versus Connor decision.
Right. Well, and the other part of this is training. And so you've been on both sides of the training. And that's something else that's kind of intriguing, because I watched a couple of videos where they've even asked Black Lives Matters movement individuals, a couple leaders, BLM leaders, to go through police training. And it was interesting to watch them because they didn't have the kind of training police officer did. In almost every case, they made major mistakes, which seem pretty obvious, but when your heart is pumping, you have never been trained effectively, you're going to react, and in some cases overreact in the wrong ways. And so training is key. And when we hear this defund the police, essentially the first thing that gets defunded, apart from some of the police officers out on the beat, is the training. And that's actually key, isn't it?
Yes, that is the first part that's probably going to go. Police officers receive training throughout their careers, not just right at the beginning. And if there's no money to do that, then they have to revert to their core function of patrol, and that's going to go away. Training's going to go away. But you pointed out the training is so important in the use of force arena, and the use of force arena is really what we're talking about here. In almost every case, officers who are untrained or unskilled tend to either overreact or underreact, right? And exactly as you pointed out, the more skilled you can make a police officer, the more confident you can make them. You actually raise their reasonableness standard by doing that, right? If our standard is reasonable use of force, but our officer is out of shape, untrained, unskilled, and scared to death, then their use of force escalates very, very quickly. But a skilled police officer who's highly trained, in good physical condition, is confident because of their skill level and their training, chooses a much broader use of force spectrum, has a lot more choices before they end up escalating all the way up to deadly force. So training is the best way to improve use of force decisions, and that's actually what the defunders are going to get rid of.
Yes. One more issue I wanted to put on the table is something I've talked about before. As a matter of fact, I was just noticing my February 21st article, Viewpoints Commentary, dealt with this, and that is what is called over-criminalization. That's something the Heritage Foundation has talked about. And, when I look at a couple of these tragic deaths, certainly Eric Garner fits into that category, and maybe some others as well. In some respects, we're actually, because we have criminalized certain kinds of behavior, police have to get involved, and sometimes that ends up in a tragedy which probably didn't have to happen in the first place. And you use that example in your article as well, don't you?
Yes, the Eric Garner example is a tragic one, but it's a perfect example of that, right? He was being arrested for selling loose cigarettes, which most of us probably say, well, why is that even illegal? Well, it's illegal because the city wants their tax money, and they don't get tax money from his sales if he's bought the pack and then is selling them individually. And so they place the police then in the position of being somewhat tax collectors, right? Revenue generators.
Right.
And the problem with that is, as you said, once we've criminalized it, the police are under no requirement to back down because of perceived resistance, right? So that it's going to escalate as far and as high as the offender escalates it. Once you start resisting arrest, it doesn't matter what you were being arrested for. If you escalate it all the way up to the use of deadly force, which was not the situation there, by the way.
But he still died from it. Yes. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
And he died in the process.
And again, I think that's the issue, is that even sometimes it's, quote, non-lethal force. We can have all sorts of debates about how much fentanyl George Floyd had and some of these others, but in some respects, even doing things that aren't considered lethal force end up in the death. And I think the perfect example which you use there is Eric Gardner. Here is an individual who was just selling loose cigarettes, and he ends up dying. And it's a circumstance that should never have happened. But again, that gets us back to that very contentious issue that I've written about before, and we've talked about on this program, of over-criminalization. Just before we go, let's talk about the fact that if people want more information from you, they can certainly contact you at the organization that you are part of, and that is Texas Public Policy Foundation. We have a link there. It's texaspolicy.com. So if they would like to have you come and maybe speak to this issue, maybe it's a Chamber of Commerce issue, maybe it's the church would like to know more about police officer training or those kinds of things, they can contact you there at texaspolicy.com, can't they?
Yes, absolutely.
And so, again, I would encourage you to find out more. We've had various guests on from the Texas Public Policy Foundation. There is multimedia. There are various events coming up. There are various issues and a variety of other things that you need to know about. Of course, today we've been talking about the whole issue of criminal justice, but they've been talking about energy policy and all sorts of salary issues and funding issues and all the rest. And so we encourage you to find out more about Texas Public Policy Foundation. And Randy, thank you for writing this article, and thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me, Kerby.
We're going to take a break. Again, this article, I would really commend it to you because you'll learn a lot. I think you probably already did. Don't defund the police, improve policing. And it takes you through, some of the justification for policing and law enforcement and training. It has a reference, of course, to Romans 13. We have some questions about how to use force. What about this issue of over-criminalization? And he concludes by saying training is the best mechanism for improving our policing. Then depriving police departments of resources to do so is far more problems than policing actually fixes. So, great article. We've posted on the website. We'll have more right after this.
"2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, just before we get to George Barna at the top of the hour, I wanted to get into a couple of other issues, and my commentary today is on the NBA. It's called the NBA boycotts, and the question on the table is, can NBA players boycott the games? Well, they did, and can they? Well, they certainly are free to do so as long as the league allows them to do so, and the league allows them to do a lot of things, including posting all sorts of things on their Facebook and Twitter accounts, and posting various words like Black Lives Matter on shirts and jerseys and on the gym floor and whatever else. So, okay, that's the case. But, of course, the point I make is freedom works both ways. They're free to boycott the games, and we're free to boycott watching the games or even turn them off. And so that is the case in many ways. But there's an interesting connection that I found over the weekend, and this was done by Larry Elder. Larry Elder, of course, is a talk show host, African-American, and has been on the program with us before, because he makes a good case, because he's a little bit critical of a few of the African-American coaches and players, because he says pro athletes, this is the title of his piece, ignore facts, stats, and data when denouncing systemic police brutality. And he, for example, has one quote from Doc Rivers, who is the coach of the Los Angeles Clippers, who talks about blacks being killed. They were the ones being shot. We're the ones being denied to live in certain communities. We're being hung. We're being shot. Goes through this whole idea of systematic racism. Then he has a couple, well, at least a quote from LeBron James. You know, you have no idea that a cop that day left the house if they had a bad day or a good day, and they might end up killing us. And so the point he's making is they make these statements about the systemic police brutality, and yet they live in a world of facts and stats and data. As a matter of fact, sports really is all about anymore numbers, statistics, and records and those kinds of things. And he said, you know, where are the various individuals making these declarative statements? If they were to simply look at some of the facts, they may not make those declarative statements. And, of course, we're seeing more and more. We live in a world right now where people just say it, and then you say, well, why do you say that? They'll go, because I said it. Well, no, but do you have any evidence of it? Why are you challenging me? And so oftentimes the conversation gets no further. But Larry Elder is one who, even as an African-American, said, you know, some of my fellow African-Americans are making statements that just factually are incorrect. And he, for example, after talking about how players will use statistics and career statistics and shooting averages and all that to justify getting paid more, then they turn a blind eye to some of the numbers. And he says any analysis of whether cops are killing blacks because they're black would begin with noting the approximate 50 million police-civilian interactions that occur every year. Out of those 50 million interactions, about 11 million people are arrested. And in recent years, 60,000 cops have been assaulted annually. I don't think we even hear about that, the number of assaults on police officers, although we're starting to hear about it with some of those largely peaceful protests, which most of us would call riots. But then he goes on to say that all of this, the 50 million police-civilian interactions, have resulted in 1,000 people being killed by the police on average. He's kind of giving you the general average over the last couple of years, with almost all the suspects resisting with a weapon or resisting violently. Of those 1,000 killed annually, 250 are black, 500 are white, twice as many white, which you might say, yes, but of course there are many more whites than blacks. Okay. But he also says then the percentage of police shootings that involve a white cop and an unarmed black suspect is less than 4% of the total. The percentage of white cops killing unarmed black men did not reasonably pose a threat is even smaller. And he also points out that even when you look at that 4%, well, what about those unarmed? And he points out that one of the probably most visible examples of that would be Michael Brown, Ferguson, Missouri. We've talked about that before because he was on the statistic unarmed, but of course we have the DNA on his gun, on the officer's gun, indicating that of course he was attempting to grab it. And so he just tries to say that if you were just look at these numbers or these statistics and treat them the same way the NBA treats other statistics as valid and a justification for paying a person more or considering this player a success or a bust, you would begin to maybe temper some of the kinds of things that you say. He also reminds us of one other fact that we've mentioned on this before, and that is a police officer is 18 and a half times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by a police officer. So that brings us back to those other numbers of the 60,000 police officers that were actually assaulted last year. And it brings us to one other thing I'd mention before we take a break, and that is we're hearing a lot of people talking about Breonna Taylor. And there's a very good reason for that. First of all, she's a female. Most of the other individuals that are African American are male. Number two, most of them have a police record. Not that that justifies that, but it makes it a little less likely to turn them into some kind of victim or martyr or saint. And in the case of Breonna Taylor, you're talking about a 26-year-old woman who was killed in Louisville, Kentucky. And, of course, that investigation is still ongoing, and we talked about the Attorney General there in Kentucky the other day. And, a matter of fact, you even had, during the Democratic National Convention, Michelle Obama argue, well, just really state, that Breonna Taylor was murdered by the police. Now, if you're out there on the streets, and I've watched enough video to say that oftentimes they will say her name. Why do they want you to say her name? Because they see her as a good example of how the police were hunting her down. Because if you go out on the street, you will hear people say that they actually instituted a no-knock warrant, went to the wrong address, found her in bed, and shot her in bed. Everything I just told you is wrong. Every bit of it. Yet, nevertheless, that's what you get out there on the street. And, of course, you've had Beyonce and a variety of others demanding criminal charges against these individuals. So in the few minutes we have left, let's at least try to clear up some of the misconceptions. And if you find yourself saying, I've got to read it for myself, I would encourage you to do so. The Daily Wire posted it in August 29th and talked about 7 myths and misconceptions about the Breonna Taylor case. By the way, why do they say her name? Well, we're going to talk about that on Thursday because we will talk about, as our conversation is going to focus a little bit more on one of our guests who is going to be talking about some of the mystical aspects of that, but I'll get to that in just a minute. Let's at least look at the myths. Myth number 1, that the officers raided Breonna's home were at the wrong address. No, that is certainly not the case. This was a actual warrant to get a fair amount of drug paraphernalia and other evidence in a particular criminal trial. And so you can honestly see that that was not the case. According to the Louisville Courier-Journal, Taylor's name, birth date, and Social Security number are listed on the warrant, so they knew exactly who she was, they knew why she was there, and all of the rest. And they were actually trying to find material related to the crack cocaine dealer, Jamarcus Glover. Myth number 2, it wasn't necessary for law enforcement to raid Taylor's apartment because the main suspect was already in custody. Yes, he was in custody at 12:40 in the morning, or the early morning, or after midnight, but they were also there to gather information on this drug bust of this individual that was a crack cocaine dealer. Number 3, the police raided the apartment without knocking. Again, untrue. Yes, they did have a no-knock warrant, and I mentioned just the other day that you have the senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul, who actually has named his piece of legislation Justice for Breonna Taylor because he wants to have the police change their methodology and no-knock warrants, but they actually did knock on the door numerous times, but the individuals, that is Brianna and her boyfriend, did not answer because they were fearful of who that might be. Myth number 4, Brianna was shot while in bed. No, what happened is when the police forced open the door at 12:43, her boyfriend started shooting at the police. And once they did, they returned rounds shot in there. And somehow, still, it's unclear how they missed him, but hurt and shot her. And so she was shot actually in the hallway. Number 5, the officer shot during the raid was hit by friendly fire. No, he was actually, we can now document, shot by the boyfriend. And then the idea that police shot Brianna 8 times, that is incorrect. And the final claim, of course, is that she worked as an EMT at the time of her death. Actually, she was an intern. But you can go through the myths and misconceptions about this and recognize that oftentimes what is known on the street, or even what is known by people making declarative statements, is just factually incorrect. But again, don't believe what we have to say. Look it up for yourself. I think you'll be surprised at the myth and misinformation that's out there right now when we talk about police shootings. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention, and I sort of said this in passing, but I think it would be very important for you to go back, if you can do so, and check some of the stories of those individuals that have been used to justify the argument that police are hunting down African Americans. And we just a minute ago talked about the story of Breonna Taylor, who is certainly being mentioned so often in the various debates. But you can go all the way back to things we've discussed and even commentaries we've done on, say, Michael Brown. Did he say, hands up, don't shoot? No, he did not. And we know a lot more from not only the federal investigation, but the state investigation, the local investigation that took place at the time, an investigation into Eric Holder, African-American Attorney General under Barack Obama, African-American president, who concluded that this was not an attempt to shoot somebody in the back, that he did not say, hands up, don't shoot, and all the things that are related to that. And it reminded me of the famous quote of Ronald Reagan, who used to say, you know, the trouble with our liberal friends isn't that they're ignorant, it's just that they know so much that isn't true. To modify that a little bit, out there on the streets right now, out in the protests and riots, are people that assume some things that just aren't true. We're learning a lot more about, for example, George Floyd. We're learning more about Jacob Blake. Did it justify the actions? No, but we're learning a lot more than we knew at the beginning, and this is why it is so important that we don't rush to judgment. If we're going to be Christians that are going to have some level of discernment, then sometimes we want to wait and hear all the facts, hear what the other side has to say, and then evaluate it. And a good example of that is something I surfaced on Friday with Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter. If you're not familiar, there has been this article that appeared in The Atlantic arguing that President Trump actually, in a couple of cases, made disparaging comments about individuals that were in the military, that they were losers and that they were suckers, and that he didn't go to some of these military events because, after all, he didn't want to get his hair wet, and, you know, all sorts of things like that. And at the time, I said this has been pretty easily contradicted by many people that were in the room. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is going to be with us next week. She said, I was actually there and one of the people of part of the discussion. This never happened. The assistant to the president, Dan Scavino, says, I was with the president in France with Sarah and have been at his side through it all. Complete lies by these anonymous sources. Stephen Miller, a senior advisor to the president back then. The president deeply wanted to attend the memorial event in question and was deeply displeased by the bad weather call. Next day, he spoke at the American Cemetery. Of course, we might also mention that the standard response to this is, well, they don't want to contradict the president because he'll come after them. You know, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, she's a wilting violet. I wouldn't want to speak the truth. Well, then you go to John Bolton. He just came back from a tour, really. He was basically saying all sorts of disparaging things about the president. Did he once has come out and say, oh, I should have put that in my book? No, he didn't. And the point I'm making is simply this. I want to go to a piece by Gary DeMar. Love Gary because he says, we as Christians need to recognize that the scriptures actually tell us that we should always have 2 or 3 witnesses. And so when you have these individuals that are anonymous sources, that essentially is at the same level of hearsay testimony that wouldn't even hold up in a court of law. It wouldn't hold up in a court in the Old Testament theocracy. And he says when you have people that say they have a knowledge of the discussion, it sounds like what you're saying is they're a secondhand source. Would you trust a secondhand source? And so he talks about the 11 eyewitnesses that have gone on the record denying the president. But on the other hand, you people have, including a Fox reporter, Jennifer Griffin, who said these are unimpeachable anonymous sources. Well, of course, you have to ask one other question. Why did this surface 2 years later? And why isn't it in books, some of the tell-all books? That's a good question. But I want to get to the biblical stuff because that's something that maybe I'm going to even do a booklet on, when you can trust testimony. And let's recognize that sometimes when you have one person's testimony, it can get you in a lot of trouble. That would be Joseph in Genesis 39, where the unsubstantiated testimony of one woman put him in jail. But let's now, if we can, for just a minute, look at both what does the Old Testament and the New Testament say about various sources. For example, Deuteronomy 17. On the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, he who is to die shall be put to death. He shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. Okay, so first of all, a much higher standard in the Old Testament law. Not 1 witness, not 2, preferably 3. You might say, well, we're not putting somebody to death. Okay, I understand that, but it's certainly one of the principles here. But then, later on, let's go to Deuteronomy 19 now. A single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. So now that's about a sin. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. So again, when you are not only putting a person to death, but even when you're convicting them of some kind of sin, you see that to be the case. So that's in the Old Testament. I go through the Old Testament, but you might say, well, do we have any in the New Testament? Oh, I think we do. How about Matthew 18? This is what we oftentimes talk about in terms of church discipline, because we say that if an individual is wronged an individual, if there is a problem of sin within the church, if there is a grievance, and the individual will not actually listen to you after you've brought that grievance, what does Jesus say next? Now, these are part of the red letter Bible. So if you're only the person that believes what the red letters say, Jesus then goes on to say, now take 1 or 2 more with you, so that by the mouth of what? 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact shall be what? Confirmed. You might say, well, that's what Jesus had to say. You can go to also one of the things the Apostle Paul talked about in 2 Corinthians, every fact is to be confirmed by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Or even when, interestingly enough, the Apostle Paul is writing to Timothy, one of the last letters he ever wrote, in 1 Timothy 5:19, do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. So whether we look at a court of law in the Old Testament, whether we look at an issue in the church, a division between people in the body of Christ, or whether we look at an accusation against an elder in the church, what is the criterion? 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, I could go on, but we're running out of time, but I think it's just another principle I want to pass on. Did the president make these disparaging comments? It's possible. It's very unlikely. We have a lot of people that disagree with that. You might say, well, yeah, he said something about John McCain. Yeah, he did. Probably shouldn't have. And we would be the first to criticize him if we could find that he indeed said this. But the point is a bigger issue. And that is when you see anonymous sources, sometimes you have to say, what needs to be verified, at least according to scriptural principles, is 2 or 3 witnesses who are willing to come forward. And when you have anonymous sources, you never can test their veracity. You can never cross-examine them. And there are all sorts of biblical principles about the fact that, sometimes a particular accusation seems true until the other person has a chance to respond. So just a principle I wanted to apply here. We'll see where this goes in the next couple of days, but we already have Biden commercials and advertisements and campaign material assuming that what is in the Atlantic is true. And I think if you're going to be a wise and discerning Christian, you should ask for a much higher level of confirmation before you believe it. Anyway, let's take a break. We're going to come back, and I think one of the biggest issues on the ballot this November are worldviews. And George Barna has a lot of interesting things to say about that right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View. Hope you had a great Labor Day weekend, and we're now back live. And in just a minute, we're going to be talking with our good friend George Barna. We've posted an article that you can find which links to some of his research on worldviews and the 2020 election. After we're finished with him, we'll get into some of the questions being raised about whether or not these mail-in ballots might be disqualified if we look at the trend that is played out in places like New York and New Jersey, now surfacing also in Rhode Island. And we look at especially what could be happening in many of the battleground states. And that would be, of course, places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and others. And then we look at some of the deadlines. We may be in for a very long period of time. Our friends at the Wall Street Journal put it this way: will the courts pick the next president? Let's hope not. But again, if we have a close election, and that is quite likely, that is a possibility, and all the scenario that unfolds we'll talk about later this hour. Next hour, we're going to talk briefly with Robin Steele, new book, How to Be Made Whole, and I think you're going to enjoy that. Just a really powerful testimony, and then we'll get into a couple of the other articles I've posted here. Why I didn't raise my fist when Black Lives Matter challenged me. By the way, a woman who is a liberal who would agree with Black Lives Matter, but also because she's a liberal, not a leftist, says you should not be intimidated in doing that. You should be convinced in, and I think that is very good, but I thought it was kind of interesting, her piece that appeared in the Washington Post, and then also one on fake headlines from Michael Brown, who, by the way, will be with us next week when we have our Truth Team. But let's, if we can, get to our good friend George Barna, professor at Arizona Christian University, president of the Cultural Research Center, and, of course, in the past founded the Barna Group. Over the last many weeks, we have been talking about his American Worldview Inventory, and we have a link to his website. You can get any or all of them. We've posted the most recent one here, America Steadily Marching Towards Dominance of Liberal Social Government Policies. And George Barna, always great to have you on the program.
Kerby, great to be back with you.
You know, we've been saying over the last couple of weeks that even though it's technically on the ballot, pro-life is on the ballot. Even though it's technically not on the ballot, judges are on the ballot. If I can paraphrase George Barna, worldview is really on the ballot because the election, as you say, will determine the dominant worldview in America. Tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, as I look at what's going on, I would say that this upcoming election is not about personalities or parties or politics. It really is an election to determine the dominant worldview that will rule America for the foreseeable future. That's not to say that there aren't going to be ups and downs in that, or that the people who are currently rioting are going to stop rioting the day after the election. I don't think that will happen. But nevertheless, what we're really voting for is a worldview. And so when you look at the different options that are on the ballot this November, we can't be thinking just about, oh, I like the way that guy looks, I like the way this woman, does whatever she does in committee meetings. I mean, really what we've got to be looking at is what is the worldview behind the policies, the worldview behind the people, because that's what we have to vote for. That's our key decision.
Yes. And so what you found, and this should be no surprise to our listeners, especially if they've been listening the last couple of weeks or if they've read any one of your 50 different books, is that Christians with a biblical worldview look at the world very differently than the rest of Americans. What did you find?
Well, as we looked at it and we checked out the views on many different indicators among those who have a biblical worldview and those who don't. And so, for instance, those who have a biblical worldview, 8 out of 10 times, they are consistently conservative no matter what the issue is, whether it's about fiscal policies, social policies, governance, structures, and issues. And that's very different from people who don't have a biblical worldview, who we find, by the way, are very inconsistent in their thinking. Now, that's partly because they don't have a single worldview that is their dominant lens on reality. They bolted together bits and pieces from a variety of worldviews, and so it's not surprisingly that they're not consistently conservative, they're not consistently liberal, they're simply not consistent about anything, no matter what kind of issues we look at.
One of the other ones that we've talked about so often, I have a booklet on capitalism and socialism. And again, we've oftentimes pointed out that if you indeed are younger and maybe have heard more about socialism and maybe did not grow up around the Cold War, you may be more sympathetic to the idea of socialism. But generally, it seems to me what you found is people that have a biblical worldview tend to prefer capitalism over socialism.
By a huge margin, and in fact, to me, Kerby, one of the most interesting numbers was finding that 98% of the people who prefer socialism to capitalism reject the biblical worldview. And yet those who have a biblical worldview prefer capitalism because of the many elements that it contains, the many things that it allows for. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a big difference. 83% of people with a biblical worldview preferred capitalism. So that's one of the distinguishing characteristics. And again, it puts it in that same framework. This is really an election about worldview.
Yes, it is. One more comment, and that is when I look at the highest percentages among biblical worldview favoring social policies, but in particular opposing abortion, again, those are what you would assume to be pretty consistent in terms of a person with a biblical worldview, and in some respects just illustrate again that if they get their understanding of worldview right, many of these social policies come under that very easily because they now have thought about how to apply that biblical worldview to various issues they encounter every single day.
Yeah, absolutely true. And that's one of the reasons why it's so frightening that we find in this research that among born-again Christians, now those who call themselves that, but who we classify as born-again based upon their theological beliefs about eternity, about sin, about forgiveness, when you look at the 33% of adults who are born-again Christians, only 19% of them have a biblical worldview. Yeah. And so when you rightly point out that it makes such a big difference in all of the positions that they take on the various issues, that's why it's so critical that within our churches we not just be teaching good stuff, but that we really be focused on developing the worldview of the people in our churches so that they think biblically and they do so consistently.
Let me just mention that we have posted this article called Worldviews in the 2020 Election, but you can either get it that way, or again, we also have a link to ArizonaChristian.edu Cultural Research Center. But again, you don't have to remember all that because we have the link, and then you can download the most recent one there, but you can also subscribe to get the previous ones because this has been an ongoing series of research studies that George Barna has done through the Cultural Research Center. It's called the American Worldview Inventory 2020. And when we come back from the break, I want to talk about that issue, what we need to be teaching in our churches. And if you've heard George Barna on this program before, you know that what we found is that most Christians in most churches really want the pastor and the Bible study teachers to address various issues from a biblical point of view and talk about what the Bible says about those issues. But then when you go back and ask those pastors, well, have you been teaching on that recently? Not so much. So we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Should professional basketball players be allowed to boycott their games? Well, of course. Current NBA players, along with players in the past, have used the forum to address social issues. Technically, the decision last month was probably best described as a strike rather than a boycott, and it led to many other professional teams canceling their games as well. In a well-written and thoughtful piece, Andrew McCarthy argues that the action may be somewhat illogical, but certainly allowable. He says for a work stoppage to be successful, it has to withhold something the potential consumer wants. As he puts it, the sand is running out of the hourglass. Now, most spectators turn to sports to get away from politics and politicized issues, at least for a few hours. And it has been, in the past, an oasis from the turmoil, but that oasis is beginning to disappear. Much of it surfaced over the Star-Spangled Banner, which wasn't even the national anthem until 1931, and it wasn't even routinely played before sporting events until World War II. He says he wishes that patriotic displays were not controversial, but fine. If playing the anthem sullies the experience for a sizable number of fans, let's not do it. But the biggest issue is whether we should allow protest at the game. The owners and the NBA have decided to indulge the behavior for now. The players are free to kneel before the game or even boycott the game. But you know what? The spectators are also free to boycott the league and tune them out. Freedom works both ways. McCarthy says he loves sports, but sporting events are just one of many things he enjoys. During this playoff run, the NBA players are in a bubble because of the pandemic. That means they play to lots of empty seats. But if they keep up this behavior, they will be playing to lots of empty seats next year. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with George Barna. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about the importance of election 2020. And I'm holding up here a booklet that I did a while back, and it's entitled Making Your Vote Count. And before we even talk about educating voters, we need to encourage George Barna, some of the individuals even listening to this program. But I suspect most people listening to this program probably are registered to vote, but they probably know people that are not. And in this, I give an example of one particular election in Missouri where the margin between the victor and the one that was defeated was 3,900 votes, and yet they identified 102,000 unregistered Christian voters. That's in Missouri. Okay, I'll pick on somebody else. North Carolina. Here's another election where the margin was 14,177 votes, but they found in that area there were 281,000 unregistered Christian voters. So given the fact that we're doing this broadcast today in September, and it's still possible that you can register to vote, the first step would be to actually recognize how many Christians aren't even registered to vote. And then I'd love to get your comments about, even then when Christians are registered to vote, how many actually turn out to vote. What have you found?
Yeah, I mean, currently we've got more than 25 million born-again Christians who are not registered to vote. So if we got half of those people to register, I mean, that could turn the election around right there. But then when we look at the turnout, we find that really it's not that different than the rest of the population. We do have a particular group of Christians. We call them the sage cons, and my last book, I wrote a lot about the Sage Cons
Mm-hmm.
because really they were instrumental in the 2016 election, putting Mr. Trump over the edge in that particular election. Because even though they started out not backing Mr. Trump, by the time of Election Day in 2016, 91% of them turned out, and 93% of them actually voted for Mr. Trump. So that concentrated effort by SageCons, which stands for Spiritually Active Governance Engaged Conservative Christians, people who get involved in politics not because they like it, but because they believe the Bible teaches we need to be involved in every dimension of culture, including politics and government. So they studied up on it, they got involved, they voted, they were active in this. And we need more of that in this election.
Well, I certainly think so. Let's talk about the education, because we do have quite a number of people listen to this program that are pastors or Bible fellowship teachers or Sunday school teachers or a variety of others. And so there is a very significant opportunity to educate individuals. And I alluded to a study that you've done before, but let's go through it again, because it was striking to me that when you ask various born-again evangelical Christians, would you like to hear from people in authority? It could be your pastor, it could be your Sunday school teacher, to address various issues. And you had a number of issues that you listed there. Would you like to hear how those can actually be approached from a biblical point of view? The overwhelming majority of them said yes. But then when you went back and asked, for example, pastors in particular, have you actually taught on this or preached on this in the last year? Not so many, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, what people were telling us, 2 out of 3 people in the pews were saying, I'm dying for my pastor to teach me how to think biblically about the issues. What they were not saying to us was, I want my pastor to tell me who to vote for. Basically, Christians are saying, I need to know how to apply biblical truth to everyday situations. And one of the ones that's going to impact our life for a prolonged period of time is who we put into public office and what kind of laws they make. And so they were saying, yeah, I need to know how to think biblically about these things. One of the most fascinating elements that came out of that research was we also discovered that of all the different segments, now 80 different segments of the population that I took a look at, the group that was least likely to be talking to their friends and family and coworkers about the election were devoted Christians.
Yes.
Now, the reason for that was because they said, I don't want to misrepresent the Bible. I don't want to do wrong by God. I want to get it right, but I don't know what's right. That's why I need my pastor to teach me these things.
One other issue, and I might take some phone calls if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, is some people say, well, if the pastor or even a Sunday school teacher speaks about these moral issues, would they lose their tax-exempt status? And I have that in the booklet here as well. Of course, we've had Kelly Shackelford on so many times, and First Liberty Institute has a kind of a one-page summary. And there's a few things that a church, a 501c3 organization cannot do. They cannot endorse a candidate. I have hardly if I've ever seen too many pastors ever want to do that. And they cannot give money to one candidate over another. Okay, I've never seen anybody do that. But nevertheless, there is a tremendous amount of freedom because pastors can speak about these issues. They can certainly educate them about what are oftentimes called hot-button issues. They can provide information in the foyer of the church if they would so want to do so. And they can even invite candidates of the 2 different parties to come and speak. As long as they invite each one of those, if one turns it down, the other can have a chance to speak. So there are just a lot of things that can be done and should be done, because what you are surfacing with your surveys is that a lot of Christians are saying, I just don't know what to say. Hopefully when they listen to Point of View, we give them a lot more information. We make these booklets available and we have articles. But for a lot of people, this is a desire that the pastor can address. And I think they can do that in a way that's not sectarian or partisan, but really just try to educate members of the body of Christ to be more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And this whole discussion relates to the fact that what we also found in the last 2 election studies is that one of the most significant tools that people have turned to have been voter guides, things that will help them to look at the issues and where candidates stand on the issues. But, of course, in order for a voter guide to be useful, you need to know where you stand on the issues. And that's where this kind of biblical teaching has to come into play so that Christians are well informed and they're only going to support candidates who are on board with biblical principles.
I might just mention, we're going to take a break after you go, and I see some people want to even suggest websites they found helpful, and we've certainly had some links to those as well. But I think the first step, as you pointed out, is to know what you believe and to know what the Bible has to say about those key issues, and that is certainly the case. But just before we run out of time, I wanted to talk about this set of findings. This particular one, of course, America steadily marching towards dominance of liberal social and government policies. But we, over the last many weeks, George Barna, have been talking about your America Worldview Inventory. And, of course, I suspect it'll probably come out as a book. But until that is the case, this is just a great set of resources for pastors and teachers, just for educated Christians to know where we are right now in the body of Christ. So talk about what is available, what they can find at the Cultural Research Center, and how they can download all of that material and then have access to all the research that you've done over these many weeks.
Yeah, at that website, culturalresearchcenter.com, they can find all 9 of the releases that have come from the American Worldview Inventory so far. I'm working on the next one now. That'll come out in about a week or so. Every 2 weeks, we're putting out a new one. So they can subscribe and have these sent to them automatically. They can download the old ones. I hope they'll do that. They'll print them. They'll distribute them, because we need to understand where we stand. Today in America, we don't have very many people who are thinking biblically. We certainly are in a great environment right now for that to happen, where because of COVID, because of all the challenges we faced through that, we have an opportunity to hit the reset button and to try to figure out once again, what really matters, and to get back to basics, go back to the foundations of biblical teaching as the basis of how we make our choices.
Very good. George Barna, always great to have you on the program. And, of course, when that 10th one comes out, we'll pick that one up and talk about it as well here on Point of View. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kirby. I look forward to it.
We're going to take a break, and then if some of you would like to join us, I'm going to have kind of an open line. I've got some things to say about mail-in ballots. Those of you up in Rhode Island are well aware of the controversy that's unfolded there. Of course, we've had a controversy in New York and New Jersey, a question about whether or not is it possible that the courts will really pick the next president. Let's hope not, but we can talk about that as well. But if you have some thoughts about this election and where you have found great helpful information so that you are more educated, that is the case. First step is, if you're not registered to vote, and I suspect most of you listening to this program are already registered to vote, but you may know somebody that's not. It could be a friend, a relative. It could be one of your kids that said, oh, I didn't know I could register to vote, or I moved back from college and I didn't re-register. This is the time to act right now. And then we want to do what we can to educate you on these issues. But if you have some thoughts about this election, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take those calls right after this.
"2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You know, I mentioned the idea of making your vote count, and the first step is, of course, registering to vote. Again, most of you probably are registered to vote. Maybe some of you aren't sure, and there is a way to check that, and we've even put that on our website in the past. Maybe we can do it again. But the deadline for registering to vote for most of the states where we broadcast is October 5th. Not all. Interestingly enough, our friends in California, it's 2 weeks later, October 19th, which I think is a little late because really you almost need a month to be registered to vote, to check everything out, make sure that there aren't any kind of mistakes or maybe any kind of fraud. But nevertheless, for most of us in the listening audience, it takes place next month. But don't postpone it. If you are not registered to vote or you know somebody in your family, your extended family, in your church that's not registered to vote, register them to vote. We throw away our greatest privilege to vote, and the stewardship of the vote sometimes gets buried and ignored. So that's the first step. Then, of course, encouraging people to educate themselves about these issues and then to go out there and cast an intelligent vote. Where do we get good information? Well, we have the iVoter Guide. We, of course, have posted all sorts of various election summary material, various voter guides, and all sorts of things, and we will do that again here at Point of View. But Marielle in Arizona wanted to mention another resource that she thought was very helpful. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hello?
Yes, you're on the air.
Yes. My name is Marielle. I know that you mentioned iVoterGuide.com.
Uh-huh.
That's an important one. It tells whether the candidates are conservative or how conservative they are. And that's also voteyourvalues2020.com.
Mm-hmm.
That's where they've identified that only about 25% of church-going Christians actually vote or vote their values.
Sadly.
You can go there and you can pray. There's resources there, such as when to vote and what different resources, and so you can go and pray for those Christians that they'll get out and vote. And also, My Faith, that's voteyourvalues2020.com. And the other one is myfaithvote.org.
Right. Mm-hmm. And we usually have links to all of those, My Faith Votes and iVoter and a number of others. Just get as much information as you possibly can. And what we've done in the past, and we'll see what we can put together this time, is lots of times we'll have a picture of the United States and you can click on your state, and then we try to post links to as many as we can find. But of course, you probably are pretty good with your Google search to find some of those as well. And I would encourage you to do as much research as you possibly can. Let me just address one issue. I saw a good friend of mine say, I just really can't vote for either of these two individuals, and I'm not sure whether she is or isn't. But since it was kind of I guess I'll have to stay home kind of mindset, I posted on Facebook. I said, wait a minute. Okay, even assuming that you can't make a distinction between the two presidential candidates and the platforms, and I think you can. But, okay, I'll even concede the point that you couldn't bring yourself to vote for president. We have 35 U.S. Senate races. We have 33 regular ones, 2 special ones. We have 435 races for the House of Representatives. We have 13 governor's races, and 43 out of the 50 states, or 86 legislatures out of 99, actually have elections. And that's just at the federal and state level. By the time we get down to the local level, because you may have city council races, you may have mayor races, you may have school board races, we have more than 30,000 races in the country. And to say, I can't even go to the polls because I disagree with both of the candidates for the presidency. First of all, I have some problems with that statement, but nevertheless, I'll leave it at that. You can't go and find other individuals you could vote for. I think you have to rethink your evaluation in that regard. So anyway, that's just something I would add, and we'll get into a lot more of that as we get closer. But one of the other booklets we've just made available is this one on voter fraud. It's probably just in the mail. If you haven't received it, it's coming. And I'm going to suggest that sometimes we have voter fraud, but even if we don't have any voter fraud, there are some real problems with these mail-in ballots. So I'm calling you out, listeners in Rhode Island at the moment, because as it says here in the Wall Street Journal, Rhode Island has its legislative primary today, and already there are allegations of ballot harvesting and election fraud by a Democrat against another Democrat. All these examples we've been giving lately have been really helpful to me, because if you say we're concerned about the integrity of the election, and so that's why we need a voter ID, that's why we need to rethink whether or not we send out mail-out ballots, almost always they say, well, that's because you're you're a Republican and you believe in voter suppression. But every one of these examples, the one out of New Jersey, the one out of New York, and now the one out of Rhode Island, are in Democrat primaries. And in this particular case, what happened back in July, and our listeners in Rhode Island probably know this, there was a consent decree that actually said that they should suspend the legal requirement that voters complete a mail-in ballot before two witnesses or a notary. That case then was taken to the First Circuit Court of Appeals, which actually upheld it, and the Supreme Court decided not to intervene, although you had Justices Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Neil Gorsuch say they would have stayed the decree. Okay. Fast forward now a few weeks, they say, and you have the State Senator Sam Bell is accusing his primary challenger, Joanne Ryan, of election fraud and preying on seniors because Rhode Island lets voters who miss the deadline to apply for mail-in ballots to authorize a surrogate to pick up and return the ballot for them. What possibly could go wrong there, right? Well, it turns out that they're now accusing individuals of asking elderly residents in a lot of these nursing homes and others, asking for authorization to pick up their ballots. Sometimes they don't even disclose who they work for. And then sometimes they even assist the elderly in filling out the ballots and returning them. And so that has unfolded today in Rhode Island, and it will be a controversy which will maybe follow over the next couple of weeks. And it illustrates, again, what we've talked about. And if you're just joining the program and you've never heard this before, we talked about the fact that in Paterson, New Jersey, which is the third largest city in New Jersey, they've had to do a mulligan. They're going to actually redo the city council election, which will happen on November 3rd, because they had to throw out 25% of the ballots. We also had a ruling that came down in the 12th congressional race, and that one, again, was a Democrat race there, a Democratic primary, in which finally the judge, after 2 months, had to just simply declare a winner in that regard. And so that is the case. Okay, let's now go to a couple of other states. I'm talking to those of you in Georgia now. The Georgia voting deadline is unambiguous, according to this particular piece that also appeared in the Wall Street Journal. Absentee ballots are due when the polls close on Election Day. But guess what? That means up until that day, you theoretically, as the president suggested the other day, you could actually go in and vote and then mail a ballot and nobody would see that you voted twice. I'm not encouraging you to do that. That is election fraud, but it shows you how that kind of fraud can take place. Now, in the past, election laws require that any ballot that arrives the day after the election, that would be after, which then would be set aside, stored, and eventually destroyed. But now there are all sorts of people challenging that in the state of Georgia because last Monday, a federal judge issued a preliminary injunction that orders Georgia officials to count all ballots postmarked by Election Day, even if they don't show up until 3 days later. Okay, let's move from Georgia to our listeners in Pennsylvania. We have now a similar kind of litigation that also showed up in Pennsylvania Supreme Court last week, and they accepted a lawsuit. It hasn't been ruled yet, but this was filed by the state Democratic Party and officials suggesting that the, in particular, ballots could be counted if they arrive by November 6th, even if the postmark is missing or illegible. So you now see where we're going with this. We may not know on the night of November 3rd. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure we won't know for certain on November 3rd who wins the presidency. We may not know in some of these other congressional elections or state elections. Let's pick out our listeners in Ohio. Yes, you are in there too. The League of Women Voters is challenging the process for verifying the signatures, which is the way we can have some kind of voter integrity when you send in an absentee ballot. And for the listeners in Minnesota, it has now waived a rule that absentee ballots must be signed by a witness, and the state Supreme Court is weighing an appeal on that suspension, which, of course, as you might imagine, was brought by the campaign of President Donald Trump. So you can see very quickly here that if this election is close and goes into overtime between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, a few thousand votes in one state or the other could actually change the outcome, which is why some people said you might have a red mirage on November 3rd that then is overcome later by a blue tsunami. So I have a lot more to say because there's just a lot more happening in all these states, but we need to take a break. I'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail in just a few minutes, but let me just mention that there is all the opportunity for you to vote in person, and given the fact that most of these polling places are open for a very long period of time, over many days, you can do this with a mask. But this is where all of a sudden people have said maybe these mail-in ballots will go the wrong way, because the assumption has always been that mail-in ballots are supported by the Democrats, and mail-in ballots are actually seen as dangerous by the Republicans, in particular Donald Trump and the Attorney General Bill Barr. But now, thanks to some of the research done by NPR, I'm going to be quoting from NPR, National Public Radio, because they have done a very extensive survey. They found, interestingly enough, that Biden supporters are twice as likely, almost twice as likely, as Trump supporters to say they'll vote by mail. The problem is this. if you look at what has been a trend over these last couple of months in terms of these primaries, the rejection rates that have actually rejected even absentee ballots, much less mail-in ballots, are much higher. And so, as one study found, up to 3 times as many voters in battleground states could have their votes discarded compared to 2016, because if we just look at the rejection rates that have played themselves out in the 2020 cycle, and that continues, you can see that to be the case. Let me use 2 examples I just mentioned a minute ago. Originally, the number of ballots rejected in the Patterson, New Jersey case was about 3,000 out of 16,000. By the time they were through, it was basically almost 25% of those ballots were rejected. In the case of the congressional race, the congressional race for the 12th congressional district in New York, again, 25%. When you have 1 out of every 4 ballots being rejected, you can see the problem with mail-in balloting. And so if you are a listener that wants to make sure that your vote for Donald Trump goes through, or your vote for Joe Biden goes through, you probably don't want to actually use a mail-in ballot. And I'm not saying that because it means that the Postal Service is inefficient. But again, the Postal Service has found that they have been able to identify 1.6 million pieces from April through June that were delivered late. And before you want to actually blame the new Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, he didn't come on until June 15th. So you can't blame him, although he's now being investigated by the House. But leave it to Nancy Pelosi to do that one. But let's go on to some other issues here, because in our state of Ohio, we have a lot of listeners in Ohio, you can actually count ballots up to 10 days later as long as they are postmarked by the election date. And so that is the case. You have a situation in Michigan where a voting envelope was printed without an address for the correct elections office, which caused the ballot to be returned to the voter. So that one didn't count. And then we have all sorts of examples of where these discarded ballots were more than the individuals who actually won in those cases. Let's take, for example, in Wisconsin, this spring they had a situation in which they essentially discarded 23,000 ballots for all sorts of reasons. Incorrect signature, all sorts of things. Well, Donald Trump only won that state by 22,000 votes. Let's take another one. You have, for example, a study in Florida found that the mail-in rejection rates were twice as high for African-American voters as for Anglo voters. Now, it wasn't because of racism, although you can always consider that's a possibility. It has to do with the fact that in order for these mail-in ballots to actually be accepted, they have to be signed. The signature has to match. You have to have it put in the mail by a reasonable amount of time. It has to be postmarked. And oftentimes, some of the individuals that have never done that before, I mean, if you've been doing mail-in balloting in Oregon, in Washington, in Colorado, in Hawaii, for example, you know how to do this. You've been doing this for some time. But if this is the first time you've ever done it and you don't know some of the details, you can kind of see where this can lead. And so there are now some real concerns as to whether or not mail-in ballots, which Donald Trump has been disparaging, actually may do more harm to possibly Biden supporters than Trump supporters. And so, again, we can see, here's another one from the Associated Press. When you look at 7 battleground states, including Michigan and Pennsylvania, between 185,000 and nearly 300,000 absentee ballots could be discarded if the rejection rate that has been working up until now in the primaries happens when you actually go to the vote in November. And as I pointed out before, if you look at, for example, Pennsylvania, swing straight, as many as 43,000 absentee ballots could be rejected compared to just 2,100 that were rejected back in 2016. Donald Trump won that particular state by 43,000 votes. So the rejection rates are equal to or more than the actual way in which Donald Trump won some of those battleground states. So it's all an attempt to at least try to help you understand that the best and safest way to vote and to make sure your vote counts is in person. And so we're starting to see a lot more of that taking place. More than 500,000 ballots were rejected in this year's presidential primaries. 500,000. And they were discarded for, as this particular article by Rich Lowry points out, for improper postmarks, signatures, and all sorts of things. Sometimes people accidentally voted for more than one candidate, which invalidated that. And so this is the case. And going back to the case out of New York, in this primary, finally, after this period of time, the judge ruled that Representative Carolyn Maloney won by 3,700 votes. But the number of rejected mail-in ballots in the 12th congressional district was 3 times that 3,700 vote margin. So you can begin to see very quickly that this is not going to bode well. And again, if you'd like to read more, National Public Radio has looked at these absentee ballots that were rejected in Wisconsin's primary, recognized that would exceed the margin that Trump won in that state, looked at the number of absentee ballots that were rejected in Pennsylvania, which is comparable to or equal to the number of votes that Donald Trump won by. And you can begin to see that even apart from the issue of voter fraud, we just have all sorts of other difficulties that are now going to unfold because we are in many states that have never had mail-in balloting and never had the experience with it, trying to make some kind of attempt to make it possible for people to vote not in person. I recognize the fear that people have, but when I see people going into Walmarts and they're going into restaurants and going into grocery stores to tell me that you can't spend a few minutes in a polling place to vote is sort of hard for me to imagine. Nevertheless, we need to take a break, and when we come back, going to focus on a couple of issues. Robin Steele with us as we talk about his book, How to Be Made Whole, and then we'll get into a couple of the other articles I've posted on the website, one having to do with why did this woman, who was a liberal and agreed with Black Lives Matter, didn't raise her fist when she was confronted. I think her answer really helps us understand the difference between the left and liberals. Even though she's a liberal, she doesn't believe in this idea of bullying. And then we'll wind down with some really good material done by Michael Brown on some of the fake headlines and the need for us to have discernment. Let's take a break, though. We've got a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
As Christians and being pro-life, we certainly want to reach out to families that have children with disability. We want to encourage churches to have a ministry to special needs children of families. And so I think this is going to be a real encouragement to you in that regard. But it also talks about the lessons we can learn from some of those situations that we find ourselves in. And it's in this new book, How to Be Made Whole, an answer to the whole question by Robin Steele. It's published by Westbow Press, and if you want more information, we have information about it on the website. That's a division of Thomas Nelson and Zondervan, and the author of that is Robin Steele, who is the founder and also the lead pastor of Promised Land Church, which is in San Marcos, Texas. Started about 16 years ago with about 30 people, a membership now over 2,000. But back a number of years ago, 2001, he and his wife, Erica, received news that their newborn baby had a severe brain abnormality, probably only lived 6 to 12 months. Kennedy's 18 years of age, and we have a link to, of course, mademeaningful.com. You can see her picture and see the video. There's also the Made Meaningful podcast, which is available, and, of course, this book, which I think you're really going to appreciate. And so, Robin, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Might just mention that the book is not quite out yet, but we're just a few days ahead of it, so people can advance order it or start looking for it in their local bookstore. I might also mention that the foreword is by Randy Phillips of our friends Phillips, Craig, and Dean. And, of course, you have just an incredible story, so I'm smart enough to know I need to step back, let you tell the story for just a few minutes of you and Erica and Kennedy, because it is an incredible story, and you are to be commended for your tenacity. And once again, it reminds us, as we've talked about on this program so often, doctors say, well, we practice medicine, and that's practice medicine, because she outlived everybody's prediction, didn't they?
Yeah, up until that moment that we found out about her disability, my life had been just, I would say, easy. I had a great family. I had great parents. I was raised as a Christian. I got my degree in marketing. I met my wife at church. I mean, everything was just rolling along, and so much so that I probably was a little bit arrogant. I was training and studying to be a pastor, and doing everything I could to learn that ministry, and came from a perspective of just pray for your needs, and God will touch it and get over it, basically. And it wasn't until my wife and I, had this doctor's visit in 2001 that our world was just rocked, and we couldn't do anything about it. The doctors was, looking at the sonogram. My wife was 30 weeks pregnant, and up until that day, she hadn't been sick a day. She didn't have morning sickness. Everything had been developing perfectly fine, and she wanted to have a home birth. And I said, well, we at least need a sonogram just to make sure everything's cool if we're going to do this at home. I was nervous about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a children's pastor at the time, and we found out about a free sonogram program at the community college, and that was, that fit my budget.
Yes.
As a children's pastor. So
that's right.
I said, let's go. So we went, and they took forever. They were looking, and finally they said, we just can't see what we need to see, so we're going to send you to a specialist. And later that day, we went to the specialist, and he said, you know what, we need to go back to my office. And
yeah, and I love what you say there. That long walk felt very similar, of when you sometimes get yourself in trouble at school or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, that walk down that hallway seemed like it took an eternity, didn't it?
Oh, it was terrible. I mean, it just felt like the world was closing in because, you have your first pregnancy, your first baby. You're so excited, thinking about college, thinking about, all these amazing things that your kids are going to do. And he takes us down the hall. We sit in his office, and he says, the thing that we couldn't see on the sonogram is your baby's brain.
Yes.
And it's just a thin, super thin layer next to her skull. Everything else is fluid. It's just fluid. And so you can continue with the pregnancy, and we can do a C-section in about 8 weeks. And at that point, we can do a surgery to alleviate the fluid, but that's all we can do. We don't know what's going to happen. He said you also could go to Kansas and get an abortion at 30 weeks.
I thought that was one of the most striking things in this book, because as we know, we broadcast in 42 different states, and one of the states we've looked at is, of course, the fact that you can get late trimester abortions in Kansas, and that one just was kind of riveting as I was reading your book as well.
Oh, man, Texas is not that way, but so my wife and I sat there, and of course, we're Christians, we're believers, and we just said, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to go for this. And in our mind, we're thinking, God's going to show up. He's going to bring healing. She's going to be born. Everything's going to be fine. We'll just keep going. And so we started going to the doctor more and more and going towards this delivery. And every time we would go, he was like, it's getting worse. And so we finally got to the birthday, and they bring her out of the womb, and it's the best day and it's the worst day because a birth is just incredible. It's exciting. There's nothing like it. At the same time, we saw her head was quite a bit bigger than a normal baby.
Yes.
And so our hearts sunk, and our life was changed, from that day forward. And we just went straight to an MRI, and they came back and said, it's worse than we thought. Not only is there too much fluid in that brain, but it didn't even form correctly. So she's probably going to live about 6 months, and you probably, just take her home and enjoy her, basically, for the next few months.
Wow.
So we did that. Took her home and have been enjoying her for 18 years now. But,
again, I encourage people to go to the website because they can find that information. They can watch the video. They can see information about the book and a number of other things because it's an incredible story. But I need to take one of those mandatory breaks. When we come back, though, I wanted to talk a little bit about how this has changed you. Anybody that has a special needs child, anybody that's ever been through a trauma, a challenge, an obstacle, a closed door, can relate to this because then you remind us, if you want to maybe put in your mind's eye, and this is well drawn out in the book, think of an iceberg. There's the part above the surface, but underneath the surface is the mistakes, our pain, in our view of ourselves and God. And so I thought maybe whether individuals are dealing with the same thing that you and your wife have been dealing with, and certainly you and Erica have learned quite a bit from Kennedy. I think this would be applied to all of our listeners, and that's really, in a sense, the theme that runs through the book, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's take a break then, and we'll continue our conversation with Robin Steele. The book is coming out next week, and we wanted to give you an advance notice. You can, of course, advance order it, and, of course, we give you a link to their website. You might also want to follow the Made Meaningful podcast, but mademeaningful.com is the link, and we have it on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Should professional basketball players be allowed to boycott their games? Well, of course, current NBA players, along with players in the past, have used the forum to address social issues. Technically, the decision last month was probably best described as a strike rather than a boycott, and it led to many other professional teams canceling their games as well. In a well-written and thoughtful piece, Andrew McCarthy argues that the action may be somewhat illogical, but certainly allowable. He says for a work stoppage to be successful, it has to withhold something the potential consumer wants. As he puts it, the sand is running out of the hourglass. Now, most spectators turn to sports to get away from politics and politicized issues, at least for a few hours. And it has been, in the past, an oasis from the turmoil, but that oasis is beginning to disappear. Much of it surfaced over the Star-Spangled Banner, which wasn't even the national anthem until 1931, and it wasn't even routinely played before sporting events until World War II. He says he wishes that patriotic displays were not controversial, but fine. If playing the anthem sullies the experience for a sizable number of fans, let's not do it. But the biggest issue is whether we should allow protest at the game. The owners and the NBA have decided to indulge the behavior for now. The players are free to kneel before the game or even boycott the game. But you know what? The spectators are also free to boycott the league and tune them out. Freedom works both ways. McCarthy says he loves sports, but sporting events are just one of many things he enjoys. During this playoff run, the NBA players are in a bubble because of the pandemic. That means they play to lots of empty seats. But if they keep up this behavior, they will be playing to lots of empty seats next year. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Robin Steele with us for a few more minutes. His book is entitled How to Be Made Whole. It comes out next week. I wanted to give you an advanced look at the book, an answer to the whole question. About 160 pages, broken into three sections. What is the whole question? How to be whole, and how to live whole. And I might just certainly encourage you to see in the cover there is an iceberg. If you go to the video, Robin, people are going to go, okay, it starts out with an iceberg, and look, is this like a National Geographic special? What is that? And so I already kind of gave people an indication that throughout the book, you begin to talk about the things that are above the surface and things that are below the surface. And in some respects, you and your wife really had a chance to learn some new lessons because of your daughter Kennedy, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we realized that we were trying to find our peace and our wholeness just by fixing the things in our life that were undone, you know, or stressful or lacking in some way. And so it's just this rat race of continually trying to fix this over here, and then we kind of get it propped up, and then something else pops up. And this peace was elusive because we kept, you know, just running around. And it wasn't until the situation with my daughter confronted us that we started learning that, man, we're running around dealing with things that are above the surface of our life. And, you know, an iceberg is profound because 90% of an iceberg is below the surface. And it just seems like most of us are spending all of our energy, spending our time, our money, our effort, dealing with the part of our life that's above the surface that everybody sees. And underneath, there's just gaping holes in whether it's our past, our mistakes. But ultimately, when you go really deep It's our belief of who we are. It's our belief about who God is and what God says about us. And so our daughter, she above the surface can do nothing. She has beaten odds. She's 18 years old, but she's unable to use her hands, her feet. She can't talk. She can't eat with her mouth. She's tube fed. She requires 24-hour nursing care. And so, on the surface, people might think, well, man, you lost that bet of not getting an abortion. You should have just aborted her. But in reality, when you're around my daughter, just for a few minutes, you understand that she's probably one of the most whole people you'll ever meet.
Yes.
Because just deep down below the surface, she's content. She's happy. She loves to laugh. She loves to smile. She's never met a stranger. She's not judgmental. She's not concerned about, all the things that we're concerned about. And so it's just a beautiful, beautiful picture.
Yes. Well, and as you point out, as a pastor, let's focus on that. Do you believe that God loves us? Do we trust that we are the son or daughter of God? Who are we? What is our identity? It brings you back to really important questions, which all of us need to ask, whether we have a child with special needs or not. We all have challenges. We all have mistakes. We all have pain. We all misperceive ourselves. We just had Chip Ingram on recently talking about how we, in many cases, look at ourselves like we look at a picture at a fun house in one of those funny mirrors. And so it really brings us back to important issues that you address in the book. And in some respects, I would hope that as people see this book, not only as they read it individually, the way you've put this together, this really can be a small group study and a Bible study and really can help address some of those issues. So with your pastor's heart, talk about how we can use this book more effectively, not just individually, but collectively.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very simply put together. As you said, 3 parts. It's a quick read. It's not very complicated, but it does teach some deep theological things, and it also gives some very practical ways to live it out. And so, I would love for people to get it and use it as a group study. We're doing that in our church, but it's very practical and dealing with some things that people wrestle with a lot. So one of the issues that came up early on was that a doctor told us that our daughter's life would not be, quote, meaningful. And when that doctor said that, it just rocked our world. And I was kind of thankful for it, even though it was so harsh, because it really set us on this clear journey of, who decides when she's meaningful. Like, would that doctor think she's meaningful if she could talk or she could drive a car? Or, at what point does someone cross over into a meaningful life? And it's just sad to see so many people chasing after that and not hearing the Father's clear voice that he loves us, he accepts us, we're his kids, and ultimately he's in control of everything. And so I'm hoping people can see the message of God's goodness and grace through the story of my daughter.
Most people, as you talk about in the book, go through their entire life trying to maybe get something that looks like wholeness, and they never really get it. And they want their life to mean something. They want to make a difference. They want to matter. We talk about do all lives matter? Of course, all lives matter. That is certainly one of the themes that runs through your book. And you really help us understand that if we keep trying to find the things on this earth or the approval of our peers to get wholeness, it's just never going to happen, because you're never going to find wholeness because you're always going to find flaws. You're always going to be confronting with your mistakes, your difficulties, your pain, and all that. And if you don't see yourself as God sees you and see yourself clearly, you're going to miss the intent that God had for us to have an abundant life.
Oh, absolutely. I guess the bottom line is that we don't have to get to a place in our life where everything's perfect before we can have our peace and our wholeness. We can have wholeness from God all the way through the depths of our being before it all gets worked out. You know, we don't have to trade one for the other. God actually can bring very beautiful, meaningful, rich experiences in our life in the midst of something that is impossible to fix.
Yes. Let's just for a few minutes talk about what is available. Some people might say, Kerby, you did it to us again. You're talking about a book that's not out till next week. And I've had a few of those lately where I've done the interview a week ahead of time. But they can already, first of all, pre-order, and they can go to your website to do that. But they can also get a sample copy of one of the chapters, can't they?
Absolutely. If you go to my website, mademeaningful.com, you can pre-order the book. You can also get a sample chapter on my website. But it will next week be available on Amazon and all the main areas. An Audible book, a ebook, and paperback.
And one other thing I would want to mention as well, because that involves not only you but your sweet wife, the Made Meaningful podcast. And that is where you really take on some of those issues. And it's everything from raising kids and church life and news headlines and all sorts of stuff. So that's something that people can subscribe to as well. So talk about that for a minute, if you might.
Yeah, I'm kind of laughing because my wife is incredible. She is just funny. She is practical. She's real. This podcast is all about our lives, unfiltered, unedited, and just the raw and the real conversations about, with special needs. Obviously, we love connecting with special needs parents. That's our tribe, you know, but parents in general. We have 2 kids, 14 and 16-year-old boys that just went back to school today in person. And they are typical 14 and 16-year-old boys, and they're actually harder to raise sometimes than our special needs daughters. So
we know that as well. Let's talk about that blog, too, because your latest one, I just had to laugh. It's on the never-ending story. So, you know, with Treyu and all that, and the Luck Dragon, all those kinds of stuff. So you're all over the map in terms of the things that you address, right?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that one was written by my wife. So on our blog, we both write. She's a midwife as well, so she's super busy. But I try to get her to write because every time she writes a blog, people love it. And she's, I mess with her and say, you know, you're the best writer and speaker we have in our family. But she's so busy. But once she gets going, it's awesome.
Well, tell Erica, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people now that are going to click out on that just because they probably love the never-ending story and wanted to see what she had to say about it. And you got a clip there and everything. So, again, the book is coming out next week. I just want to give everybody an advance look for it. They can go to your website to find it there, and all that information is at the website, pointofview.net. And, Robin, thank you for the good work you're doing down there in San Marcos. Next time I'm in San Marcos, I'll come and shake your hand. And it was great to have you on the program today.
Would love that. Thank you so much.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to move on to a couple of other issues. You'll notice that I've posted a couple of articles here, and I just thought you might want to see those, and we'll get into that. But last half hour, open line, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the articles I've posted here is by Lauren Victor. Not anybody that you would know, other than she said, I did not raise my fist. And what we're talking about is that she was at a dinner in the District of Columbia with a friend in an outside neighborhood restaurant. Having gone to Georgetown, I'm familiar with that. And what you had is a situation in which a number of people with Black Lives Matter movement marched around repeatedly calling for people to, you've heard it before, say her name, or we've already talked about that earlier, or the whole issue of raise your fist, confess your white privilege, whatever it might be. I'm gathering from this piece that she wrote that she's probably a liberal in the sense that we make a distinction between the liberals and the left. And that is something that Dennis Prager, when he's been on the program, even before he was on the program, we've talked about, because a typical liberal will say, look, I may disagree with your viewpoint, but I'll defend your right to have that viewpoint. And I'm going to even be talking and doing a chapel service at Dallas Seminary on Friday. And I'm going to talk about that because it used to be that many times I and many other speakers were invited into college campuses to speak. And the idea sometimes I'd even be introduced by a professor, say, look, you've had a chance to hear from my perspective here. I want you to hear a different perspective. That's not happening anymore because you're not allowed to have another viewpoint. The left says, no, we will actually silence you. And as a matter of fact, if you don't agree with us, even your silence is violence. And so a lot of that goes back to the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Well, anyway, Lauren Victor finds herself in a situation where they're in her face. And if you've seen the videos, they're pretty confrontive. I've oftentimes thought, what would I do in that situation? I'd say, well, first of all, can I stand up? Because then you're not shouting on top of me. At least I can have my own personal space for a second. And if they wouldn't let me do that, well, then things get a little out of hand. And you recognize that when you're sitting down and somebody's standing over you, that can be pretty intimidating. So first of all, she explains why she didn't raise her fist. And she said, let us not lose track of the underlying incident that led to the protest. The day before, Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back by a police officer in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and talks about the fact he was paralyzed and a number of other things. And she said too many shootings have occurred elsewhere that should not have happened. And so, again, she understands the Black Lives Matter situation. But at the same time, the second point she made, I thought was really good. It's never okay to coerce people's participation. That is just bullying. To be clear, this is not an argument against anger expressed loudly about terrible things that are allowed to happen. My desire is simply to see the vital energy that anger gives rise to be effectively directed to bring about important, lasting change. Hey, could we agree with that? Certainly. So she says, as the marchers closed in on my table, I could not see any protest signs. I asked who they were and why they were marching. No one would answer me. Why march and hold back your message? This is not your usual Black Lives Matter protest, or really any other protest I've attended. Marchers are usually delighted to tell you about their mission. When they crowded around my table and started demanding that I raise my fist, it was their insistence that I participate in something I did not understand that led me to withhold my hand. In retrospect, I would have done the same thing even if it was crystal clear to me who they were and what they stood for. If you want my support, ask of it freely. That's what we do in a democracy. And she said the protest video is more of a snapshot than a complete story. The more important thing that you do not see is what happened afterwards. My instincts kept telling me this was not a crowd inclined to perpetuate violence with more violence. In the end, someone said, let's go, and the protesters moved on. They were not pleased with me, but I was not hurt in any way. No one ever tried to raise my hand for me or threw so much as a paper straw in my direction. And so the point she's making is, of course, that these protesters and these individuals were just really trying to elicit a reaction. What is so striking, first of all, is that she represents what I think is your typical liberal view. A liberal view says we want to engage in some kind of civil dialogue, even though a conservative and a liberal may disagree, or I don't even know what your view is. I'm going to try to make the case for my view, and I'm going to do that in a situation that respects you as a person. Well, that's the liberal point of view. What she encountered, though, is the leftist point of view that says, just agree with me, and I'm going to bully you into agreeing with me. Now, here comes the other point, which I think is relevant to the fact that as a Christian program, she didn't understand. Because she says in the middle of the video, you can clearly hear a woman demanding, "Are you a Christian?" And she again says that's a prime Rorschach moment. Some have assumed she meant it accusatorily. I must be a Christian, that's why I won't raise my hand. Well, that could be the case. I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. But others assume the opposite. If I were a good Christian, I would raise my hand. I believe she meant the latter. I answered, no. Why are you asking me that? How is that relevant? I never got an answer. Well, there's 2 points. Number one, is it possible that a Christian said, look, I'm not going to kneel because I'll kneel before Jesus, but I'm not going to kneel before you? Or also a Christian say, look, I'm not going to raise my hand because I may disagree with you. But there's another element going on, and that I really want to postpone till Thursday because we're going to have Abe Hamilton on the program. And as Abe Hamilton has pointed out in his American Family Radio broadcast, and as Michael Brown, who I'm going to quote in just a minute, has also pointed out in one of his articles, some of the founders of Black Lives Matter movement, that would be a variety of individuals that have actually been promoting this idea of spirits. And when they say her name, sometimes they want to call up the dead spirit. And if you're a Christian, maybe you're challenging some of the actions, the spiritual movement that we're doing. But we'll talk about that with Abe Hamilton on Thursday. And what you're going to find out is Patricia Cullors and Alicia Garza and a variety of others have also gotten very much involved in wanting to conjure up spirits. So that question that she thought was so puzzling, are you a Christian, actually is kind of intriguing. But nevertheless, I wanted you to see this piece because I think it illustrates only so well the fact that if you're going to really try to address this issue of racial reconciliation, address this issue of times in which the police officers have not exercised discretion, and you're concerned about the loss of life, whether black or white, Hispanic, Asian, whatever, that you want to be able to make your case. And I think this particular editorial op-ed piece, if nothing else, I think so illustrates the fact that she couldn't understand why they wouldn't have her raise her hand. And she says, you have to ask for my permission. You have to ask for my support. You have to make the case for the support. And that's not what we see with the riots and the protests taking place. One of the other articles I've posted here comes from Michael Brown, who I just mentioned a minute ago, and he talks about these fake headlines. I would encourage you to read it because he takes on a couple. First, the fact that the argument, and I need to apologize to my audience because all week I was quoting the fact that they said that fewer people watched the Republican National Convention than the Democratic National Convention, and he gives you all the headlines from CNN, NPR, Huffington Post, Forbes, and others. Well, it turns out that if you actually add up all the numbers, the Republican National Convention was watched by a whole lot more people than the Democratic National Convention. The best estimates, according to some of the people associated with that, 147 million viewers compared to about 122 million viewers for the Democratic National Convention. And he points out that sometimes these headlines, if you don't read a little bit further, simply actually say the wrong thing. And then he goes into another example, which is the only other one I'll use before we take a break, and that is you see on this headline, Delaware police arrest man with gun at Planned Parenthood. The headline makes you think that, oh, maybe this is another one of these fanatical pro-lifers trying to take law into her own hands or his own hands. But then when you actually read the story, you realize, no, it was a pro-abortionist with a gun threatening the pro-lifers. But the headline says, Delaware police arrest man with a gun at Planned Parenthood. It just naturally leads you to think that it was a pro-life crazy person with a gun. It was actually somebody who was pro-abortionist with a gun threatening the pro-lifers. So all of this, as he goes through many other headlines, to once again come back to a theme that is run through this program over the last couple of months. Use discernment. Read widely. Read the rest of the article. Sometimes the headlines are completely false. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that tomorrow, Penna Dexter is going to be hosting because she has lined up 5 different guests. How are you going to get 5 guests in 3 hours? She's going to have to use an electronic shoehorn to get them all in, but I think it'll be a very good interview and set of interviews. And then I did mention Abraham will be with us. Abe Hamilton will be with us on Thursday, and I look forward to that interview there. We'll get into that in more detail. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to that in just a minute. But one of the states that everybody's been looking at is Pennsylvania. It's a battleground state for sure. And a new poll that just came out the other day by Rasmussen, which tends to be a little more accurate, I think, than others, reports that Trump and Biden, that is, again, President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden, are actually tied, each one getting 46% from likely voters. If the tie continues, I can tell you who wins, because in addition to that, they also identified 4% of voters who said they were undecided. I think I've learned by now that when an individual tells the pollster that he or she is undecided, they're really going to vote for Trump, but they don't feel comfortable saying so. Another 4% said they did not intend to vote for either candidate. We'll see where that is. But interestingly enough, of the 82% of likely voters who know who they intend to vote for, Trump leads Biden 51% to 49%. And so Pennsylvania may be more significant, but it gets back to what I'll talk about in just a minute in terms of these mail-in ballots and some of that. And it's kind of very interesting that when you see Trump ahead of Biden 51% to 49%, one of the reasons is the African-American vote. The other day, you might remember that we had Robert Woodson on the program of the Woodson Center. He's African-American, been watching the black vote. And last time, to be honest, Donald Trump got about 8% of the black vote if you assume that the exit polls are accurate. And that's the best we can come with. So 8% was not a great showing. This time, the estimate, according to Rasmussen, is that the president has support of 27% of African-American voters, likely voters that identify themselves both as likely voters and African-American. And that is, again, validating something that Robert Woodson said, because I said, well, last time Donald Trump got 8%. Do you think you'll get more? He said, oh, yeah, I think he'll get about 19%. And even at the time, I said 19% is a lot more than 8%. Well, 27% is a lot more than 8% and a lot more than 19%. So that has really been kind of interesting to see how that plays out. Anyway, let's take some phone calls. I mentioned Georgia earlier, and on the Good News Network, Scott is joining us today. Scott, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Okay. Thank you, Kirby, for taking my call. And I'm a poll worker here in the state of Georgia.
Good for you. I'm glad you're doing that.
I'm also, I get absentee ballot because I'm over 65. But I know that you can't vote twice. Because I know some come in that had, I'll go back to 2018 with me. I wanted to vote because I was a poll worker, but I already sent my absentee ballot in.
Uh-huh.
That showed that I had already voted, and they didn't show that I had. They just showed I had absentee ballot sent to me.
Right.
And they would not allow me to vote, and I'm a poll worker. And now I had to change I had to cancel the absentee, and then I was able to vote. Now, people that come in here and with absentee ballots and some other questions, they are given a provincial ballot.
That's right.
And and then they check that through the system. But you got to hang here this year in Georgia. They get your ID, they print out your ballot, how you voted, and they scan it. So people, they got a pretty sure way.
Very good. And again, one of the reasons I brought it up is because what you have right now is last Monday, so that's a week ago yesterday, that's where a judge issued a preliminary injunction at this point, and that has to do with whether or not Georgia officials can count ballots postmarked by the election day, even if they don't show up until a number of days after. So it, in some cases, maybe will not happen in Georgia, although some days people think of Georgia as kind of a battleground state. So we will see. But I think it's really interesting to see I think the last time I heard somebody looking at that, I think it was Hans von Spakowski saying there were about 150 lawsuits that he had been following on this this issue. And let's just be fair, both Republicans and Democratic lawyers are out there doing some things. I mentioned the one in Minnesota. That was challenged by one of the Trump campaign, right? That Minnesota, which had waived its rule that absentee ballots must be signed by a witness. And that was then an appeal that was brought in this case by people in President Trump's campaign. And of course, that's the sad reality, is that, the president's been very critical of this whole idea of mail-in ballots. But there's a very good piece by David Harsanyi that points out that on the left, they really have been doing that. And I quoted earlier from an op-ed in the Washington Post. Let me quote from Rosa Brooks, who wrote in the Outlook section of the Washington Post. By the way, she is a professor of law at Georgetown. I went to Georgetown University. Georgetown Law School is a different area there, but part of the Transition Integrity Project. And if you read that piece, you would think that anybody that has an R next to their name is just terrible, because they're talking about how the people associated with the Trump campaign are ruthless and unconstrained right out of the gate. They're seditious, autocratic, highly, and then, of course, concerned about this highly politicized Supreme Court, which, by the way, as I said before, this article that appeared by the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, will the courts pick the next president? It's quite possible that could take place. But then has this fictional game that was played in which John Podesta played the role of Joe Biden, in which he decided not to concede the election, alleges voter suppression, goes after various states that Donald Trump wins, like Wisconsin and Michigan, requires and calls for the Democratic governors of Wisconsin and Michigan to send pro-Biden electors to the Electoral College. Then there's a controversy in the House of Representatives whether to accept it. In the meantime, California, Oregon, and Washington threat to secede from the Union. And then you go down the rest of it. And so it's just unbelievable, the, if you will, the fever swamp conspiracy theories out there. Of course, you've heard the other one. Donald Trump, if he loses, he will have to be ushered out of the White House by the military, and all these other ones. It's just after a while, helps you understand that there is just almost an attempt on both sides, but especially lately from some of these articles that appeared in the Washington Post and MSNBC and the Slate and others, to delegitimize the election, perhaps because they're starting to see, as I pointed out just a minute ago, that now Donald Trump is ahead in one of the swing states, Pennsylvania. And if I am correct, and by looking at some of these mail-in ballots that were invalidated last time, if indeed twice as many Biden voters are going to use mail-in ballots compared to Trump voters, there's a real high likelihood that some of those mail-in ballots, if not done carefully, will be invalidated, and then we will have an election that goes into overtime and then has to be decided in the House of Representatives or by the Supreme Court. And by the way, if none of that takes place, there's a law that says that by January 20th, if we still don't have a clear winner, the Speaker of the House becomes the next President of the United States, Nancy Pelosi. Are you ready for all this stuff? It's going to be a crazy 2020, but what else do you expect? Look at everything we've been through with the pandemic and all the rest. That's all I have. Penn and Dexter tomorrow. I'm back here on Thursday. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes, and we will see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.